compared to the rest of the world, how does Australia fare in terms of ensuring women's right to safety?
It's difficult to compare because, first of all, this is an underreported crime. So, and that's because, for a range of reasons, namely that women may have been very reluctant to reach out for support because if the system doesn't protect them, that's when women and their children are usually in greater danger when they try to win the relationship. And so if we don't have a really strong system, justice response, services, support, housing, things like that, it can limit women's willingness to reach out. So subsequently, we don't really have the data on the extent, and we haven't really gathered data on the usefulness of interventions. There's been a lot of work, I guess it also depends upon who you compare Australia with, and I guess compared to countries where there are no family violence services whatsoever, or where family violence responses are still largely the domain of women's services where they exist, we're doing well. But while there has been work done across jurisdictions in Australia, legislative reform, so for example in Victoria we've had the police code of practice. It's made enormous difference to the way in which women and children are responded to. We've made great gains. However, I guess when we've had 52 women murdered so far this year, and it's only July, it's obvious that we still have a long way to go.
So is the recent increase in public and political attention to family violence translating into real change?
That's the question that plays out in my mind a lot. So I worry that this is just going to be a temporary blip where we have a lot of talk about family violence that doesn't necessarily translate into much of a difference for women and children, and may leave the broader public thinking that lots is being done. So in Victoria we have the Royal Commission, and we've got the Victorian government promising the full implementation of the Commission's recommendations. And that's really important. It will be, therefore it depends upon the quality of the responses that comes out from the Commission, so we've got a lot of hope in that. At a national level, we still don't have assurance of the services required to respond to family violence. So for example, we're the peak body for family violence services in Victoria. We've spent most of this year focusing on ensuring that proposed funding cuts to the service sector don't go ahead. So you would think at this time, with all the profile, we'd just be able to roll up our sleeves and get stuck into some significant work. However, we don't even have assurance of ongoing funding for significant parts of our service system. It's one of the reasons why we're calling for a dedicated violence against women funding stream, so that we have assurance. And so this is given the level of commitment that's required, because it's currently funded as though it's a temporary incidental issue, because the funding is pulled from a range of different funding sources, which is another reason why we have to manage proposed cuts, because the funding cuts across a range of different streams. Most of family violence services are delivered under homelessness responses, so we don't really have the data. Our services are compelled to gather data that relate to homelessness targets as opposed to service demands, what women need, things that made a difference. So We still have a long way to go just in getting the fundamentals. So I think that leaves us it's very important that the community continues to put pressure on governments across Australia to ensure that this high profile actually translates into meaningful and long-term gains.
How do rigid gender roles and sexist beliefs support the conditions that allow violence against women to flourish?
Yeah, so family violence, I guess one of the reasons why violence against women is still so rife in Australia and why we've still got so far to go is that it's still very commonly understood to be caused by, say, drug and alcohol issues or mental health issues, economic pressures, that women are as violent as men, etc. And there can definitely be a range of contributing factors, but these aren't the causal factors. When we look at the data, there's often factors of mental health issues or drug and alcohol issues, but not necessarily in all the cases that present. There might be factors of different cultural backgrounds, but certainly not in all of them, etc. The most common fundamental denominator in the cases that we see is gender. This is primarily an issue that's perpetrated by men and where women and children are overwhelmingly the victims. And when we talk about gender, it can often also be interpreted as being the physiological differences between men and women, the physical differences. But gender is actually, it refers to the way in which a community defines the social expectations around the role of men and the role of women, and the rights of men and the rights of women. And so these are fundamentally sexist. And men who choose to use violence are men who have hyper-masculine attitudes about their rights and the role of them as men. They often see their partners and their children as possessions. And this is something that is often invisible to us as a society, and particularly in service delivery. We don't have much gender literacy. We might talk about services that are accessible to people from non-English speaking backgrounds or disability, people with mental health issues, etc. We don't necessarily have much capacity across a range of different sectors, including the justice system, in understanding the impact of gender on population health outcomes. So it's still commonly thought of as just a byword. Gender is often thought of as a byword for women. But say, for example, in homelessness responses, women and men experience homelessness differently, and the drivers of homelessness for women and men are different as well. So if we're going to design effective responses, we need to be looking at how that plays out. So I guess, fundamental fundamental human rights impact on our health outcomes, and women are often really disadvantaged. So we're paid less. I think it's 14% the gap difference. There's less representation of women on boards, in positions of leadership in government, in caucus. And I think sometimes when women's groups call for equal numbers of women and men in different spheres, it can be interpreted as equality just for equality's sake. But the research shows that when we have the greater equality that we have between men and women, the reduced rates of violence against women are experienced in that community. So we have very strong expectations about the rights of men and women in our community, and that also plays out in some of the attitudes that we have about the issue. So commonly we put the focus of change on women, that she needs to leave or it's something that she provoked, and we're less likely to hold men accountable.
What specific role is there for men in combating family violence?
So another factor in how we define gender in our society is that in relation to social expectations of masculinity, it's a common theme that masculinity is something that needs to be proved over and over. So it's not static. So when women get together, they don't necessarily, challenge one another about how much of a woman are you or how feminine are you. But we see this play out with men when they challenge one another about, what are you? Are you a man? Are you a girl? Are you a poof? That kind of thing. And we can see this constant proving of masculinity in a range of different ways that's problematic in the context of violence against women, particularly when men can see women ending the relationship as a slight to their masculinity. But we can also see it play out when men are together. That also has negative outcomes for us as a community. And a really classic example is when we talk about, say, one-hit punches or men getting king hit in the cities and in public places. And often the discourse is about things like it must be something about it's alcohol fueled, and obviously that's also a big factor. But we can talk about, it's something about, it's the city, it's the type of groups of people that congregate in the city, or it's late night clubs, things like that. But we very rarely talk about the impact of gender and how men can act to assert and prove their masculinity when somebody might look at their girlfriend, or when somebody might push them, or a range of different excuses are made in ways that that this might play out. So a thing that we need men who want to create change in our community can do is challenge these things. I mean, these attitudes are held not just by men but by women. But when they are challenged, or when there is different sort of role modelling provided by men, this has incredible power. So I think sometimes men think, and women, that they can't really do anything about family violence or violence against women until they actually see some sort of altercation on the street, when in reality they can play a really powerful part in challenging the social conditions that allows violence against women to flourish, just in the same way that we know that racism is a driver of race-related violence, or homophobia is a factor in driving homophobic-related violence and discrimination. So there is a link between sexism and violence against women, and so men can play a really important role, and indeed this is critical for change in challenging the casual sexism that we see regularly in our community, but also challenging those hypermasculine attitudes. This isn't about men becoming, something that less than men or not men, but it's actually about us shedding some of the behaviours around masculinity, some of the male privilege that exists that can have such negative outcomes for us as a community.
What would you say to someone who asks, why didn't she just leave?
I guess my first point would be that we need to really shift that thinking to why doesn't he stop? Because when we ask why doesn't she leave, we are absolving men who choose to use violence completely of their of any kind of responsibility for their behaviour. And this is a choice. I think this is still something that's understood to be about an emotional outburst, or about anger, or about stress, and it doesn't really have anything to do with it. I mean, lots of women and men feel frustrated, feel powerless on a daily basis, and yet thousands and thousands of men and women across Australia every day make the decision not to use violence or be abusive to another person. So we need to ensure that when we're looking at this issue, we're not automatically thinking that it's something that women can control or change or alter. We need to be putting the focus fairly and squarely on men who choose to behave this way. Secondly, it's really difficult for women to leave. So this is one of the key risk times. This is when we see, when we're more likely to see women and children being murdered. This is when the violence escalates. It's one of the reasons why women and children can go on, so many thousands of Australian women and children can go on to experience ongoing chronic homelessness and poverty as a result of having to end the relationship. So, you know, a fundamental question is, if she does end the relationship, how will she live? So a lot of women can't afford to live independently, can't afford to pay the rent. Often the violence might be experienced as financial abuse, so women are often left with his debt but in their own name. Rental arrears, he might have smashed up the place that they were living in, which impacts on her suitability as a tenant. There's also very, very limited housing. I think Council for Homeless Persons recently did an assessment in Victoria about suburbs that were affordable to women on social security payments with dependent children, and it identified that there is only one suburb that she would be able to afford, which, you know, because of the lack of affordable housing, it's meant that there are so many people who can't even access housing. It's really pumped up the waiting list. So yeah, she might not have any other options to leave. And it used to be that women would go into refuge very briefly, and then that they would be supported to leave and in either private rental or some sort of social housing. There's not those options anymore, and so we've actually got a bottleneck of women even being able to get into refuge. Because we can't actually exit them out. So often women and children who have experienced, you know, a really traumatic experience of abuse, police have been called. They might make the decision to go into refuge and then end up being in a hotel where they can't, they might not be able to have the facilities to cook, or there's nowhere for kids to play outside. And we have that statistic about how many times it takes women to leave a violent relationship, and I wonder how much of that is not necessarily linked to the psychological factors of her commitment to that relationship, but actually about her feeling safer at home, where she knows his whereabouts and she knows what she can control, and where he's less likely to be stalking and harassing her. Or because there's no other options, she recognises that there are so few options for her children. You know, they're more likely to be taken out of school, their education disrupted. There are so many women living in cars, women and kids living in cars because there's nowhere to live. So you see women returning to violent relationships because there's simply no other options. So I guess in a nutshell, it's really critical that we stop asking the question, why doesn't she leave? We hold men who make this choice accountable for their behaviour and support a system where they feel the consequences of their behaviour as opposed to women and children. And also we invest in the supports and particularly in the status of women so that they have better options to support themselves and to live free of violence.